will give the floor to Carlos Urrutia. Well, thank you so much, Gerardo. I would like to present a joint work with Felipe Meza and Pratap that are on the second row. This work has to do with credit and the misallocation of resources. I think that is a word that has been highlighted this afternoon. Professor Georgeson said this morning how total productivity of factors as a result of results for Mexico had been stagnated. The stagnation does not mean that productivity would have been constant during the whole period. What we have is a lot of volatility. There are some times where factors increase, then they drop. And from the last of a huge drop that we have is a crisis of 2009. That is before last point in this graph. So the emphasis of our study is not to understand, like in the previous studies, the differences in productivity, total factor productivity among different countries, but what generates this movement in the short terms in the total productivity of factors. It is associated more to economic cycles than to growth literature as such. What we are studying as an example is a measure that we calculate of total factor productivity for Mexican manufacturing sector. It might not match the data of the INEGI. There's a reason why, and I can tell you at the end. But what we have is a full cycle in 2003-2010, where we have an expansion on the total factor productivity, followed by stagnation and a huge drop in 2009-2010. What I want to highlight here is we have a lot of actions of what happened in order to understand what can generate these movements within time. As the title of our work is saying, we have to link it to credit value. So all the factors behind the misallocation of resources that's behind credit has an important role to play. To motivate you, what I want to show you in this graph, departing from the database that I will describe further on in full detail, we have reconstructed short-term credit. When we talk about the model, we're talking about work capital that will allow the firms to operate. And this is the evolution of credit on manufacturing sector. Everything that has to deal with manufacturing sector. Aggregated, when I talk aggregated, is a manufacturing sector and not economy at large. So what I want to show you that we have a lot of movement through real values of credit assigned to manufacturing sector. We know there's a little bit more of volatility in 2003 and 2008. There's a growth in credit and there's a drop that is associated to the crisis that occurred in 2009. One might think that maybe this evolution of credit is a result of demand factors, the fact of the companies are contracted, and what they are contracting is the use of credit. And then if we do this credit variable for gross production of the companies, it gives us the intensity of the use of credit on the manufacturing sector. Once again, we see these ups and downs in time between 2006, 2008, and then the drop reflected by crisis. Once again, or part of the objective of our work is to link all these three graphs that I have been showing you and see if there's a relationship among them of what's happening with the credit and the other factors. The objective then, the figures that I show you are aggregated, and the analysis we are going to be doing it at a microeconomical level. It's not going to be as a firm level or farm as as Diego was working on it, it's going to be on a sector level, but a sector level that will be quite clearly defined, and we will be working for 6 digits in terms of the manufacturing sector in the US. That's 50 sectors in each of those 2 cases. Our idea this afternoon is to understand if we can explain the evolution of aggregated, and I refer to manufacturing sector, to the distortions that are common in literature when we are talking about the misallocation of resources. Those that are familiarized with that literature have nothing to explain to you, but for those who are not, those are the factors that increase the prices of inputs for companies. It could be taxes, for instance, but it doesn't have to be a tax, and it doesn't have to be something that will affecting the entire sector in the same way, or different sectors in the same way. So I'm gonna tell you what we understand as distortions. One part of the story this afternoon will be to link accounting process and what we can measure on this data with the changes of total policies of aggregates.
How much can we explain of these factors? That would be the first graph, through changes in the distortion that we measure from data. Second part will be what we consider our contribution to try and relate these changes in distortions to changes in variables related to availability and cost of credit. This will be done at a sectorial level, and, well, with regards to the work, well, this job is perhaps more empirical or quantitative than previous ones, or at least the one of a marine, but the idea is, well, part of the effort, of the empirical effort, is to mix both databases at the microeconomic level. One is the industrial survey with which the INEGI has contributed to, and the other one is a database for financial data, which is RO4. It includes all the loans given by the banks, and which the National Commission for Banking has given access to. All data are sectorial. We've never seen a company separately, so don't be afraid. Let me give you a first idea. I'm going to keep these technical part to a minimum, but there's something I need to specify. We have a production function which is aggregate at the sectorial level, so all the I's here we see in different parts referred to a subsector. It can be one of 82 subsectors working in, or one of 250 subsectors when it's 6 digits, depending on the digits for each. We'll have a production sector. We will say nothing about the optimal size of a company. We're working aggregately, and behind each sectorial aggregate or subsectorial one, there will be a series of companies with a given distribution, and our production function will admit capital work and intermediate goods. We're meeting ENS for CLEMS, but this would be M. By intermediate goods, we refer to not only input, but also service and energy. The production has scales. There's nothing with the optimal size of companies, and we admit the fact that the coefficients indicate that each of these is well, alpha epsilon have a superindex I. Let's suppose that each of these sectors faces 2 types of distortions. One that affects the ratio, the intensity of the use of intermediate goods, the ratio of intensity, the use of intermediate goods related to the gross production of a sector, and then we have a distortion that affects the capital work ratio. So, let me see, in this definition of benefits or utilities, it's what affects the work ratio, and it's like a type of tax on the capital, and this is a distortion that affects the use of intermediate goods with relation to the net value of production is also expressed as an implicit tax. So what do these distortions do? If we take the first order considerations into account, and they affect the capital ratio, capital work ratio, because of relative tasks, and it affects the intermediate sector. The greater the large distortion, the more it will deviate from the optimal norm between capital and work. The lower the distortion, the less intermediate goods will be used in terms of gross production. Now we'll have a parenthesis. What do we think of these distortions? We're not thinking the fact that they refer to taxes. In particular, these are taxes that affect differently different sectors, so they have a superindex I. So we think that, or what we want to convince you of, is that we have an explanation that can be financial. Think of the most simple model we can think for this. It's the representative company has to pay in advance. In our case, it will be intermediate goods and the cost of renting capital. Layer has to be paid in advance. What does this mean? Well, that in order to comply with this, they need to borrow money to the financial system, resources with which to pay in advance for these goods, and then we generate production, sales, income for the companies, and they can be returned for the same period. These, of course, have an interest rate, and the interest rate will be a source of distortion for this model. So we're also thinking of a model in which we not only have the distortion introduced by the interest rate itself, but that these are restricted in terms of credit. There's a limit to how much they can borrow, and this limit is related to the value of a sales of a company. And this would be the full problem for each sector, which includes the payment of financial costs and includes credit restrictions that we can see here. I don't want to enter into detail here, but what I can show you is that the type of distortion of which I referred to originally can be identified in the context that depends on the interest rate and the multiplier of this restriction. This is quite standard, I think, for those of you who have seen this model. So I want to convince you that we are speaking of movements, financial variables that affect this. So the way in which I will try to convince you of this is two steps. First part, we'll take these distortions as given, and we will forget the financial part of the model. And what I want to show you is that changes in these distortions have an important effect on the evolution of the total productivity of factors. And second, the second thing I'm going to show you is that there's a relation between financial variable and these distortions. So that's basically a plan of this presentation. Returning to the original model, in which these are simply parameters that affect the choice of inputs, will reach an expression that relates the net or the gross production of each sector with no, basically what I'm trying to say is this is productivity of factors. We won't explain this. It's residue or and changes in distortions and allocation of work. So it's a constant scale. The optimal size of a sector is not defined on the supply side, but on the demand side. So this is why this term appears that has to do with the size of this. We can't endogenize only looking at supply. So we can express this through growth rates and variables with an accent on top. Well, are factors of growth. So this depends on on the evolution of this parameter. We won't explain it. It's absolutely exogenous, and the changes in these distortions and the changes in the work allocation. So our objective is not to relate this to production for each sector. What's important in these models is that the poor allocation reflects on the aggregate, not on each sector. So if we aggregate this, and by aggregating I say adding everything that has to do with the manufacturing sector, not services or anything else. So we're going to aggregate in our habitual way. So we have constant prices, each of our inputs, and then the factors at the aggregate level in our habitual way, and with the added factors. Well, just doing some algebra, we reach this formula for the change of factors, or this expression, algebraic. It's not super index y I. It's the total aggregation of this, and it's what I showed you in the first graph. And what we're trying to express is, well, in the first graph is that, well, this has many things, but we have 4 components. One component, which we can't really say much, has to do with the technological parameters for each sector. So it will be calculated as a residue for each for each one. Different sectors will have different technologies, and these factors will change in time, and this is all captured by the first one. Or if we want to have an even more deaggregated one, in which we had companies in each sector, that would all be within this first one. Then we have a second term that has to do with reassigning factors and from one sector to another, and it has to do basically with not high productivity or low productivity. It's, as we see it in our model, these movements of workers from low distortion to high distortion would generate a drop in productivity, or movement of workers from sectors, or from high distortion to low distortion. Sorry. What I am saying is, if we didn't have that, the term, if there was no distortion, it would look like this. And the next 2 terms have to do with changes in distortion at the sectorial level for each of these sectors in time. This is for distortion of intermediate goods, and this is for distortion of capital and work. So something I'm going to show you is that once we measure these things, how important is each of these, how important is each of these 4 terms in terms of explaining the total. If this were 0, this wouldn't explain the changes of productivity and aggregated factors. So I'm going to speak of the data now. This is going to be two parts. I'm going to exclude on one hand financial variables, and then we're going to speak of the distortions, such as we measured them in the model, or how the model says we need to do this. So we're going to have a chart with numbers in them that are going to refer to the contributions of each of these factors. So we're going to use data from the annual survey provided to us by the INEGI. We have gross production numbers, employment, remuneration, state of capital, what do we build with this data? Well, three things, three elements that are part of the deaggregation I showed you a moment ago. First, distortions. We need to calculate distortion for the capital product ratio, also for the intermediate good to gross production ratio. On the right side, you have the equivalent to the first order conditions I showed you a moment ago. It's nothing more than this, than using this for the, so through the data we have here to infer what distortions we have that affect each of the sectors. A couple of details. This methodology also always have a problem that it's unable to identify distortions of factors of the production sector. So we take the US as a relative measure, and then we have participation of work, of capital, and intermediate goods, and we're going to take this from US data. So we need to identify what distortions are in terms of remuneration on services of capital and gross production of intermediate goods. So we take the first ordering condition, we put data on the right side, we say, we let you know that we use exponents calculated for the US, not Mexico, and from this we obtain distortions for each of these sectors in these two types of distortions. Then we calculate the residue of coefficient A for each sector in a quite standard way. We calculate the residue for each sector. Then this is the gross value of the production, not the aggregated one. Finally, on the right hand, we aggregate these sectorial variables, just like I showed you a couple of slides ago, where the model indicates us, and then we're ready to do our accounting. Before showing the results, I want to briefly show you what results from this. What do these distortions look like? This would be the initial distribution of distortions. It's for 2003, the first year of our sample. What we have is that distortions of intermediate goods is focused on this long tail. Means that most companies have a positive distortion. They use intermediate goods in a suboptimal way. Then we have, sorry if we take this literally, let me just say that the level of distortions is much more difficult to defend than its evolution in time, especially because of everything we have to consider. In terms of distribution, I don't know if this if this is well explained. We have different degrees of distortion, and here the capital work ratio distribution, only 20% is for one, so it's not distorted for the rest of, and the rest have a positive distortion. It has a ratio that's below optimal according to this model. So what's more interesting than the model in itself are the changes in time. So what we have here is a graph in which we have the same histograms, not for the levels of distortions, but to how this changes. The first panel, 2003 to 8, then 2008 to 2010, and what we have here is for distortion and capital work. So the distortion to this, very briefly, the distortion to work, it drops quite rapidly from 2003 to 2008 and 2008 to 2010. It's true that most sectors reduce the distortion, but the levels are lower. Here we have some statistics on this distortion to the capital, the mean. What matters here is not only the mean. I want to ensure that this is clear. We want to give you some statistic information to show you how this distribution occurs. So the mean drops for the period, then increases together with the crisis. Dispersion of these distortions increase its correlation with the productivity, which is quite important. At the beginning of the expansion periods, this drops during the crisis, the correlation increases. So this shows us that this can play an important part. If we have that more productive companies have more distribution, this will reduce the total productivity. So we have the same graphs for the other distortion. For intermediate goods, the message is similar. Between 2003 and 2008, there's a general drop in these distortions. Between 2008 and 2010, there was a small increase. The mean dropped and it stayed stable for many years, and the correlation from A increased during the crisis. So these are statistics. This is not the objective. The objective of the article is to show if these can have an effect on this chart. The first line represents the total productivity of factors for the manufacturing sector in Mexico. We have an expansion period, then a stagnation period, a huge drop 2008, 2009, and a recovery. How much of this has to do with factors that we can't explain? Well, an important part, and that's more or less reasonable. We don't have a rich enough model to explain it 100%, but the three factors that we're interested in, which are those that are related to changes in the distortion to capital and intermediate goods, play a very important role, especially at the beginning, not only during the crisis. The crisis is something, well, the distortion and capital distortion may play a part, and this is inexplicable for us. These are factors that are external from distortions, but also the impact of this is in many cases greater than technology. What is a residue? It's everything that we can't explain for any of the other reasons. And what does it have to do with in the context of this model? Well, we're doing a series of suppositions. One is that there's no changes in relative prices or factors. We're also doing linearization. So there's a problem with the approach, and this is sometimes greater than we thought. And is that if we do a 6-digit analysis, if we, instead of doing this for 82 sectors, we do a finer partition, and we do 250 sectors, the size of this residue drops, and the message stays. The part of the total productivity of factors that is due to distortions continues to be important, except during the crisis, perhaps. So this is the first part in which we establish a relation. Well, distortions occur because or play an important role in explaining the differences of productivity between countries, also the changes of these factors in time. What I want to show you in the last 3 minutes is the relation between these distortions and variables that have to do with credit. Okay, and for this we will combine the previous database with this database that has to do with credit variables. We obtain them from the National Banking Commission. There's a couple of people representing them, and I thank them for this. And this database includes a universe of all the loans but from the formal bank. It doesn't include informal credit or suppliers. No, it has to do with formal banks. So we have two variables, one that has to do with credit flow and the interest rate for these credits. These two, well, we have a panel for this, they vary in time and according to the sector for each period. And they refer to short-term credit. So we are only going to show you two flashbacks. The project still has a phase which we haven't finished, in which the idea is to put it all in a model. So maybe it's something that's similar to the model in the parenthesis. So we're going to do this with the model, but what we can tell you is that the statistical model between this and the distortion to the intermediate ratio there are variables related to credit. The first is the ratio on the product, the true value of the credit. Both refer to the availability of credit, and the second, which is smaller, has to do with the interest rate, the cost of the credit that the companies face. According to our theory, we should expect that a greater availability of credit would drop the size of this distortion, and that's what we find in most cases. Different columns show different combinations of effects, and that means related to this period. And what we can find is that we find a negative sign between availability and value of distortion, and also a positive sign, which is sometimes important, between the greater interest rate, and this is what the theory would indicate to us. The second one does the same for the distortion related to intermediate goods, and what we find is quite similar. We find a negative sign for this, for reason variables, credit availability, and then we find a positive sign on the credit, and that's very important as well. In the previous case as well, in this one, we need to underscore that these coefficients, once we put them to interact for time, they seem to be quite important. The periods around the 2009 crisis, which is where we would expect financial institutions to play a more important role. I think this has been explained by us already. R square, well, let's not go back to the regressions. It's an incorrect specification for a structural model, which is what we have in our head right now. But if we just see R square, we are explaining 30–40% of distortion variance through these variables that have to do with cost of credit and availability. Just to finish, our message is that distortions to input allocation, and which have been studied very recently, seem to be important to explain the not only difference between TFP, but also in aggregate TFP, but also for economies in general. And our second one is to link this to, well, we're trying to open, well, the jump from the TFP is going from a black box to smaller black boxes. So we're trying to open those smaller black boxes and see what are behind those changes and these distortions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos. Questions and answers come next. These three presentations, I think, they remind of Siakino's work, who spoke of the importance of considering elements that are different from the traditional ones in explaining what we have in our residual. These distortions can be of great importance to explain the residual, and there are interesting proposals not only to show that there is distortion that play an important role, but also to model their behavior. And there are explanations for the dynamics on these distortions. So I think that we are in a situation that's similar to the other residual, where we say that there's ways of ensuring that this is similar to explain what's happening with the residual. So I think it's a pending task for that we actually refine the nature of these distortions. However, I think these papers are very, very interesting, and that they relate quite in a very valuable way to what we saw this morning, in the sense that there is a question open on to what measure this lag in terms of the TFP that we can see as from the INEGI's calculations, how it responds to traditional explanations of low ecologic economic growth or problems with human capital, or how this results from a problem that has to do with distortions, which is something we can fix, at least conceptually in a quite rapidly through the right policies, or to what extent current economic policy can help us, as Santiago Levy said, to have proper intentions but bad results, in the sense that they generate distortions that affect the growth capability for the economy. These comments and well, we've asked ourselves to what measure this negative TFP that we're observing in this series presented by the how does it respond to distortions or classical explanations? And this is a question I'm asking to the panel, so I now open the possibility of any questions. We send out some cards in case you want to write them down, and if you want to ask them from your seat, please just tell us who you are, and we'll send a microphone over. And please. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One to Marina. My impression is that, from my reading of how you're identifying the Brownian process of distortions, is that, well, there's two things to consider. On one hand, there are distortions that are not related to anything, and they reduce productivity. They tend to drop productivity without directly having an impact on the distribution of size of firms. And the other one you need is a distortion that is somehow correlated, and that's going to explain why the Pareto tail of the distributions in Mexico is not as long as in the United States. The natural form in which we do this would be saying that they are size-dependent distortions. In other words, that they are, yes, related to their size. And because of practical Brownian reasons, you didn't do it like this in size, but you did it in terms of age. So as time passes, because you have a drift in the Brownian movement, this is going to... The firms are going to shrink or not grow enough to generate the disparities in size that you can see in the United States.
I understand that you have done that because of a practical issue, but in a certain way, I believe that if you tried at the end to justify that the size of the firm drops within time, that the average size, that goes against what I know of almost all economies, that the conditional increases within time. And on the other side, studies, there's clean or not, of what I've seen of misallocation is that it is very difficult to explain the misallocations. If you did a regression on misallocation on the age of the firms, it would have a really pronounced result. That's what we do not find on the data. And that is mainly on terms of I understand the exercise. I think it's good, it's rich. The feedback that you are getting is good, but maybe because you are trapped because of technology, that's very elegant and useful in order to solve analytically some things. I do believe that is versus the cost of having results that are not contractual. So that is my remark.
¿Otra pregunta?
Yeah, thank you for these presentations. I always find it very interesting to listen to these micro considerations, which I think are very important for analysis. I can't say that I captured everything that was in the presentations. There was a lot of material in there. But of course, I'm a measurement person, so I have a question concerning the measurement of TFP. In particular, Carlos, when you, I mean, a key parameter in your calculation are these distortions between the various inputs, and the way you're calculating them is basically you're using. At one point, I remember this equation where you had the alphas, which is the the production elasticity of labor over capital, and there's on the other side was what you got out of your microdata, which was a ratio between the wage bill basically and some kind of remuneration of capital. Okay. Now my question is, when you use the microdata, that is the K in the microdata, the capital measure that you get out of these manufacturing surveys or otherwise. The big problem with these measures is always that these Ks, the capital measures that you get from the firms, are at historical costs. Okay, so you ask a firm, what is your capital stock? They will give you the sum of the past investments, and they just add up, the dollars from last year with those from 10 years ago. There is no correction for the age structure of the capital stock in it, right? So I was wondering if you just had to ignore that problem, or whether you could do anything about it. But it strikes me as important because everything turns around this parameter. I mean, the whole result. So in ignoring that empirical issue, I think you run the danger of getting a biased measure of your distortion. But maybe I misunderstood the way you calculate distortion.
Thank you for the question, and that allows me to clarify something that was not clear in the presentation, but we did not use the value of capital reported by sectors. That was our first inclination, but we found that the results were very hard to interpret, let's put it this way. So what we did at the end was, I don't think it's very different from what was somehow presented this morning. We used a perpetual inventory method. We used data on real investment by firms, period by period, and we did that. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was not clear from the presentation, but that's what we did.
About the Hugo comment, yeah, we have been thinking about how to make the distortions and the TFP, which is to be correlated, but so far we are just able to, for technical reasons, to show when the two processes are independent. And for sure we're going to try to look at the implications on the model, or on the bad implications of the model, contractual implications of the model. And I don't know if Diego wants to add something to that.
Yeah, maybe just to add that, of course, we're just starting, and clearly we want to explore more all these implications. I'm not so pessimistic in terms of how the model could perform with the data, because I think part of the empirical analysis of Sia and Clino in the earlier paper and more in the recent paper seems to suggest an effect that is linked to age that differs quite dramatically across countries, at least the countries that they looked at. So we have to see it. I think there's a very stark distinction of models of size dependent that are very explicit. So I'm thinking of Gustavo Ventura and Nessie Gunner. which is very nice because then you could actually look at policies that have that flavor and measure them and assess the productivity implication. But those models then tend to have effects that are somewhat different from what we think are distortions on distortions that generate reallocation more broadly, because those tend to generate reallocation around some thresholds. So I think the way I would view it is that this is a model that generates, that have distortions that are correlated to productivity. So if somehow the distortions, obviously in here this is very broad, but any distortion that says these are export taxes, who are the firms that export? They tend to be the more productive. Or foreign taxes that you looked with Richard Rogers. Those are policies that are often both either put in place or only enforced to the larger ones, to the more productive. So they all tend to have this feature that being large and productive has an implicit higher distortion. And that's the kind of disincentive to investment that I think this is capturing. But I think for sure we want to take this type of framework much more seriously to the data and then explore these implications much more finely. And I guess another side to this is that I think the literature is moving towards measuring distortions directly, and I think that's a useful route. But obviously, in here we want to just explore first what implications we have in terms of endogenizing fully this distribution of establishment level productivity.
Are there any more questions? Do we have any questions in writing? So if there are no more questions.
Yeah, I was really, it's not a question, it's more a suggestion to Carlos or to people that could have access to the data. It was striking to me to see in your table how in the crisis 2008-2009 that technological component was really important in explaining the falling TFP. And I think, so one aspect of the misallocation literature has been to study how misallocation in, not across sectors, but across productive units, across establishments, how they are affected in the times of crisis. So Oberfield is one example where he looks at the lost decade in Chile using the microdata. I think that it would be very interesting to look at what happened in Mexico at the firm, at the establishment level, and perhaps INEGI has the data to do that, in order to assess how much, how important was the crisis in terms of exacerbating frictions that could have created this misallocation.
So if there are no more questions, then I will give you your acknowledgements. For Diego, Marina, and Carlos. Thank you all, and we shall continue with our agenda.